The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Hinckley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The masses never revolt of their own accord, and they never revolt merely because they are oppressed. Indeed, so long as they are not permitted to have standards of comparison, they never even become aware that they are oppressed. Well, so said George Orwell in his novel 1984. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, that was written in 1949 in post-World War II Britain about a dystopian future of 1984. And this might be a surprise. I was around in 1984, and it didn't happen then. It didn't happen then. But who in this place and in this country would think that part of that dystopian fiction, an absolute work of fiction, would be implemented by the Albanese Labor government in terms of the Ministry of Truth? The idea, even the concept, that a public servant in a department will determine what a fact is and whether someone can have that opinion and whether they can have that reasonable belief is a yawning chasm. It is incredibly dangerous to this country, incredibly dangerous. And I, for one, Madam Deputy Speaker, cannot believe this is being put forward. I really can't. This nation, in fact, Western democracies, for centuries have been built on freedom of expression, freedom of religion, the ability for people to have free speech. And it also has centuries of law to protect individuals, to ensure that they can't be vilified. And I think the better approach would be to find a way for those centuries of law, those centuries of precedent, those centuries of other cases to be utilised in what is now a normal platform, a digital platform. And I think that would be completely understandable. But one must ask the question as to why the urgency for this bill now, in what is clearly the last days of the Albanese government as they come towards the end of this term. Why the urgency to put this bill through? Well, if you look at some of the components, Madam Deputy Speaker, things that could be considered to cause serious harm, the material that might be captured in those elements include, would you believe, misinformation in elections. Misinformation in elections. Now, clearly, if the Labor Party was so concerned about misinformation in elections, perhaps they might have taken action against their own party in Queensland. And I want to give some examples as to where this applies, Madam Deputy Speaker, because we saw in the last Queensland election what I found to be an absolute disgraceful campaign around abortion, something so sensitive, so personal. And yet we saw the Labor member for Bundaberg utilise campaign slogans which were firstly completely untrue, secondly false, third absolutely disturbing for many of the female voters, but would use lines like, "Don't let the LNP jail women for having an abortion." Now, there is no need to implement legislation like this to stop that behaviour. The Labor Party could have done it. And I hear the interjection, but this is not the United States. This is Australia. And it was completely unnecessary. It shouldn't have been done, and you don't need legislation like this to prevent it. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's not just around what can be utilised in election time. If we look at things like banks, with this legislation in place, could we have got the Banking Royal Commission, which found so many offences, so many things that needed to be addressed? If the individuals that fought for the Banking Royal Commission were silenced, as they could be under this legislation, we would never have gotten to the point where those things were addressed, where banks were found to have done absolutely, in fact, unlawful activities, and they got fixed. And I come back to the point I made earlier. The oppressors will never know that they've been oppressed if they have nothing to compare it to. Will this end up in the equivalent of digital book burning because someone who is not an academic puts forward a view that the government of the day decides is unacceptable and they're removed from digital platforms? Madam Deputy Speaker, I am 100% supportive of eliminating bullying and fake information in online platforms. And the easiest way to do that is to be able to utilise existing laws. And the easiest way to do that is to ensure there are no fake accounts. Your digital online life is your real life. And if you want to make comments, that's fine. But it should be as you, as a verified account, so that everyone knows who it is that makes those comments, that you can be found, that you can be prosecuted under existing laws, just as you would if you put and expressed those opinions in a newspaper, for example, or you went onto a television station and said something similar. We also have the issue around referendums. Now, we've just been through a very recent referendum, and there are those out there who claim that the referendum was defeated because of misinformation. And I clearly remember the member for Melbourne having a shot at me on Q&A about some of the advertising that I utilised in the referendum, claiming it was misinformation. Well, it wasn't. It was based on actual legislation that was implemented in the Western Australian state government and applied. Now, that was later withdrawn because it was a mistake, but it was factual. And the idea that any government would be able to determine what your reasonable belief is and prevent you from having it is an incredibly slippery and dangerous slope. An incredibly slippery and dangerous slope. And then we find in the legislation that there's the ability for the minister to exempt digital platforms. Well, here's a couple of proposals, Madam Deputy Speaker. For example, would this Labor government exempt a digital platform for the CFMEU, who we know have been found and convicted for criminal offences? And yet this legislation would allow the government of the day to exempt a CFMEU digital platform. This is a very, very dangerous piece of legislation, Madam Deputy Speaker. And the treatment of academics and scientists, and I'll use one which I know is well known, the views of Peter Ridd, for which he was removed from his place at university in Queensland. I don't necessarily agree with all of his views, but I agree with his absolute right to have them. And if I recall one of his elements correctly, Mr Ridd made the point that an entire flood season for a year in Queensland is the equivalent of one tide into the Barrier Reef. One wash-through, one tide. And that sounds a pretty common-sense approach to me. And how would ACMA, who will have information gathering powers, go about perhaps getting a warrant? At what level will that apply? And if we look at advice and comments from experts in the field, and I'll go to the New South Wales Solicitor General Michael Sexton, talking about this legislation. It targets contestable political opinions on social media and is based on the patronising assumption that members of the community cannot make a judgment about those opinions but must be protected from the obvious inadequacies of their judgment. And I'll come back to the referendum. The Australian people informed themselves and they made a decision, and that decision should be respected because it is the majority belief for the people who are able to vote in this country. And that is what our democratic system is about, Madam Deputy Speaker. Of course we should protect the minorities, but all governments of any stripe should govern for the majority of the people and their views. Not tell them what their views are, not prevent them from having a reasonable belief, not prevent them from putting forward that view in whatever platform they wish. And as I continue to make the point, I am totally accepting that online platforms are part of your actual life, but you should be identified. You should have verified accounts. And whether or not the big meta operators like that, to be honest, I really don't care. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a very dangerous bill. I think the Australian people, once informed, will oppose it. And I come to the question that I asked earlier. Why the urgency on this bill? Why now? Why does it need to be put forward? And the sceptic in me that's been in this place now for 11 years says because it will be all about the next federal election and whether the government of the day can control the message, the thoughts, the reasonable beliefs of the Australian people. And I find that unacceptable, and I will oppose this bill, and I will continue to oppose it, as I have done from the day that the concept was put forward, because it is not in our nation's interest, it is not in the people of Australia's interest that they cannot have their reasonable belief, they cannot put forward their view, that they cannot have freedom of speech. And we should not support this bill in this place or the other place. And if it is successfully passed, we should fight it. And if we win government next year, we should repeal it. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.